morning and welcome to the Christian Life Center. My name is Cecilia. Thank you for choosing to worship with us this morning. If you're new here, please take a look at the inside cover of your bulletin. Here you're going to see our next steps page where there are 2 simple steps to take if you'd like to get to know us more. We think this is a really great place to connect with others, and we hope you'll take the time to check out how you can make that happen. If you would like to speak with someone today, stop by our info center out in the lobby and someone there would be happy to connect with you. The next 50 Plus event is A Broad's Way, coming to CLC's auditorium Friday, September 6th at 7 p.m. A Broad's Way is a female ensemble that performs show-stopping Broadway tunes while engaging the audience in their fun. Our 50 Plus group has planned the event, but all ages are welcome to attend. The admission is $10 per person. You can get more information or sign up at the info center in the lobby. Connect on Wednesday, or COW as we affectionately call it, is back to its regular day and time this Wednesday night. We have lots of new classes for adults as well as Kids Connect classes, middle and high school ministries, and we truly believe COW is the next step to get to know more people here at the CLC and to grow deeper in your faith. We eat dinner together from 5:30 to 6, and then all classes, including Celebrate Recovery, will begin at 6:15. We look forward to seeing you there. Finally, some are sad and some are glad, but school is nearing and summer is finally coming to an end. So why not do one more family, fun, free event together? This Friday, August 23rd, is our next 4th Friday flick. We'll be showing The Secret Life of Pets 2 at 9 p.m. and the movie will take place rain or shine. If the weather is nice, we'll show the movie outside and you're welcome to bring your lawn chairs, blankets, or watch from your car. If there's rain, we'll show the movie inside the sanctuary. Either way, feel free to invite your friends, neighbors, and family. For more information about upcoming events, make sure to like us on Facebook at CLC Family, visit us online at clcfamily.church, or download our app by texting CLC Family app to 77977. Thanks for worshiping with us today.
Oh, good morning. Glad to see you, all of you. Well, most of you. Yeah, glad to see you. Y'all look nice, for sure. Well, yeah, most of you. If you're new, we have an agenda. Don't want to trick you with that. Don't want you to feel manipulated. So we're just kind of putting it out there. And here's the agenda. We wholeheartedly want you to consider being a part of this thing. Bible tells us that it's not good for men and women to be alone, and we just happen to agree with God in that. And what we found is community is really, really good and helpful for life, and we would love for you to consider being a part of this community. Even if you don't believe all this stuff yet, not sure of all this stuff, you are welcome here. And here's the invitation that we typically want to make to you. And we can do it again now that we're back in the swing of things in August. And every Wednesday, we have something called COW, which stands for Connect on Wednesdays, and it's just really a nice, simple next step that we want to make available to folks to really want to encourage you to maybe show up here and get to know some people. And we've tried to remove all the obstacles we can. There's good food. You can be a vegetarian. You can have gluten intolerances, or you can like meat and potatoes, whatever that is, and there'll be good food for you here on Wednesday night. And you don't have to RSVP. You can just show up at 5:30. And we have kids ministry and student ministry, really great stuff for middle school and high schoolers, all that happening. And then so at 5:30, we all just kind of eat together. Then at 6:15, there's all sorts of stuff going on. There's ways you can connect out in the lobby, and this room is Celebrate Recovery. That's if you got some hurts, habits, and hang-ups like the rest of us do, that you could come in and kind of find community in that. And for the next 2 weeks, starting this Wednesday, I'll be teaching a class on prayer. So got a lot going on this fall, particularly starting a Saturday night service. You might be aware of that. Still looking for more folks to jump in and volunteer. You can see the volunteer board out there. But what we wholeheartedly believe is that we can't manufacture a move of God. Like, we can't make God do things. We can't coerce it. We can't manipulate it. Nor would we want to. And kind of the premise is it's actually God doing all the work, and we're the ones that kind of get the front row seat. So it's God's work. It's our witness. And therefore, if that's the case, then prayer has got to be the way by which we participate in the kingdom. And the minute I start talking about that, it gets really confusing because you're like, I don't really understand prayer. Am I supposed to, is it like a seance? Do I say certain prayers? Do I say my own words? Do I just sit there in silence? Why would I talk to God if he already knows what I'm thinking and saying? And really, God needs me to ask him, so he'll do it. All sorts of complications as you think about prayer. And it just makes sense that we would tackle all those obstacles and roadblocks. So for the next 2 weeks on Wednesday night, we kind of tackling the prayer, why we could do it, how we should do it, all those things. So that's Wednesday night. Be a great kind of first entry point for you if you're new or if you're part of the thing for a long time. Please consider Wednesday. So that's kind of the announcement. Also, if you're new or if you've been here a while, for the last several months, we've just kind of been working through the Bible. So the Bible's not a checklist or instruction manual. At its basic level, the Bible is God's story and revealing his heart and his passion for his people. And so the story is about God and his love for his children. And so kind of what we've been working through from the beginning is kind of seeing that story kind of progress. And so we started in Genesis, which just means beginning, and kind of read through the story and saw a couple things. One of the things we saw would be the word covenant, which literally means that God is always going to do what he says he's going to do. He's going to make a promise, and he's going to fulfill it, and it's not based on any stipulations or our performance. So we kind of saw that through the whole story of Genesis, God kind of making those declarations. And then the other word we saw was providence, which is the idea that God is bending and shaping all things for our good and his glory. So he's just kind of been charting through the Bible, got through Genesis, and so just picked up on the next book, which is Exodus. And so we've been reading that. And so Genesis and Exodus, they're part of the Bible and part of the Old Testament. But they're also part of something called the Pentateuch. Really, really exciting word to say. Pentateuch. And it's the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all written by Moses. And we would say you don't really want to kind of proof text or pull out just a certain part of that and say, this is the story. All 5 books are kind of meant to be read together and understood together. And one of the dangers we see in our world, our churches, is the idea that we would just pull out a certain bit of scriptures called proof texting and just make points about who God is based on just a very limited window. And the problem with that is if you just pluck out certain scriptures, it gets really complicated. And it'd be hard to want to worship this God. And so if you don't get to see the whole story, all the story together. And in fact, today's a major reason we don't want to proof text, because I would say at the pinnacle of this story is the pinnacle of the Bible, which is the story of God's redemption, and it's the story of the Passover. And we'll work through it and all that kind of stuff, but if you don't know much about it or you do, this may be a pretty big hang-up for you. Because the story of the Passover is God frees his people. But the way by which he frees his people is by murdering other people. Right? So the story of the Passover is Jews still celebrate this idea that God came and freed their people, but the way by which he convinced the Egyptians they were oppressors was through all these plagues, and the final thing he did was wiped out, killed, murdered the firstborn of all the livestock and all the people. And if you were just to pull out just these 3 verses of scripture, or 5 verses of scripture, or chapter of scripture, and go, see, God is crazy because he murders people. And so we're going to worship this God who, in this instance, God then mandates these Jewish people, you'll see it for about 1,300 years throughout the scriptures, where they celebrate this moment that God comes through and saves his people. But the way by which he saves his people is by killing other people. So if you're on the good side of the story, the Jewish side, you're like, hooray. But if you're on the Egyptian side, this is horrific. So can you imagine even the experience every year of them watching their neighbors celebrate the Passover as a reminder of what God did for them, but also a reminder of what happened to the Egyptians? It's a horrific story. And if you just proof text and go, yep, see, God kills people, you go, yep, not interested in that God. Therefore, you got to see the whole picture of the Bible, and we'll get to do that today. And here's how I would describe the whole picture of the Bible. We'll talk about it a good bit. We call it the meta-narrative or meta-story. So it's a story about the story. Meta just means about. Story, so metadata is data about the data. This is a story about the story. And so as you start to look at the scriptures, what you'll realize is every single story in the scriptures is just a small picture of the larger story. And here's how that story works. It's creation. This idea that in the beginning there was something. There's like the genesis of a story or the beginning of a story, and we call that creation. You don't have to be a Bible scholar or even a Christian to agree that this is part of a story, because we are all part of a story, even if it's your own story. And all of those stories start somewhere, right? In the beginning. And now from a natural standpoint, we would even see creation as in all that's out there. Like the idea that there's living things. And the complicated part of this, no matter what you do, you go, I'm not sure exactly how all this works, but all of us would agree that there was nothing and then there was something. Like even to this day, it's kind of data to prove that. Here we exist and sit. So we have to go, well, how in the world do we get here? Now, that's a story for another day. But the story of the Bible starts with the explanation of how and why we got here. God spoke it. That's how, why God walked in the garden in the cool of the night. So God created human beings. And it says in his image, imago Dei. God created them in his image and his likeness, and he was connected to them. So the beginning, everything was perfect. The other part of the story is the fall. And this gets weird because this has to do with Adam and Eve. And again, if you proof text, you go, oh, God just dangled a piece of fruit in front of them. Nope, much bigger story than that. The point of the story of the fruit wasn't actually the fruit. It was the Redeemer that was going to come. But in that moment, God created them. And they basically said this. This is what happened in the scriptures. They go, God, we understand you have a plan for us, but we like our plan better. So there was an original design, the world by which it was created, and then there is the new world order that has humans going, nope, we're not interested in your things, God. We'll just do things our own way, right? That's called the fall. That's sin. And there created a huge chasm between the created things and the creator, and just a huge messy deal. Now, you have to be a Christian, watch this, to believe that the fall exists. Here's why. Think of the last time you were really sad. Shed tears sad. Like you felt something, and you were sad. Why were you sad? Because someone died? Okay, what's the sadness about? Them not being here anymore, or the pain of their death? The sadness is about your body and your brain saying, it's not supposed to be this way. Right? The idea of a permanency of death, and you go, there was and now there's not, and that is just sad, right? When you read the news and you are sad at the predicament that's going on around us, there's this sadness, and I would argue every single time a tear rolls down your face as a result of sadness, it's actually a result of this. It's a result that you are now living in this world that just feels wrong, right? Because there should have been a better way. There was a better way, and our sadness is just an indication that somewhere out there we go, there's a longing. This isn't the way it's supposed to be, right? You think about people impoverished or hungry. You go, this isn't the way it's supposed to be, and you are right. But human beings go, nope, we like our plan better than yours. And so the Bible actually tells us that there are some major, major consequences for this. Adam and Eve, it says they were naked and felt no shame, and then all of a sudden they had their eyes open and they felt deep shame and they hid. Right? So there's this experience where all of a sudden the consequences of the pain of our world, there is a hefty debt. There is a massive debt. And what's interesting, so messed up, again, can't proof text. In Numbers, part of the Pentateuch, God actually tells us what happens as a result of this. You know what he tells us? It's so interesting. He says, there is a debt that we owe, and what he tells us in Numbers is that debt is God now owns the firstborn of all creation, of all the creation. So livestock people, God literally says in this weird sense to the Israelites, the firstborn belong to me. And you go, that's so weird. Like, why the firstborn? And again, different society than ours, not very individualistic. So it was all about the honor of the family. And when a family began, the apple, or the most important part of their story, and where all the hope was kind of pictured, was in that first child. All the dreams and all the hopes and all the possibilities, right? I remember that. I remember seeing Briggs when he was so little going, Lord, I cannot believe you let me be a dad. What were you thinking? But here we are, and look, this is the beginning of a new family. And then I was like, oh, he's got a little gas bubble. And I remember pressing that little gas bubble, and like a bubble, and like a vending machine, all this stuff just comes all over me. And I'm like, but in that moment, right, just this hopefulness. And so the Bible tells us in Numbers that God actually puts a wage, or shows you what the value of that is. Okay, y'all can all stop looking at Briggs and look back up here, okay? So the value of all that stuff, he actually defines as the firstborn. And Jesus tells us in the New Testament that where our treasure is, that's where our heart is as well. And so God found the thing that they treasured the most, the firstborn. It was indicative and representative of all their hopes and dreams. And so God says, that belongs to me. Which is interesting, because in Genesis chapter 11, we find the story of Abraham, who's been made this promise of all these things, that God created the world and was going to do good things. And he tells Abraham, hey, there's a sacrifice that has to be paid. And he says, the sacrifice is, I want your son, firstborn. Abraham's deeply grieved by this, but he's not thinking God's asking for something egregious. If God would have asked Abraham for Sarah, he would have been like, no, you can't, I'm not going to sacrifice my wife. That doesn't make sense. But God, you say the firstborn of all things belong to you. So Abraham was in this weird stuck issue. He's going, well, I think I owe this. God has been very clear that his dreams are better than mine, and I can't value anything, including my firstborn, over him. And all those things belong to him. So he has the right to do this. He has the right to take this debt. He has the right to cash it in, right? And at the same time, Abraham was like, but God, you're not only just and have that right and perfect, you also are so loving. So he had a hard time reconciling, not that he wasn't supposed to do it, so he's taking his son because the firstborn belongs to God. And yet at the same time, he's going, but God, but you're loving. You're loving. And so even in the scriptures, it tells us in Hebrews that Abraham literally thought he was going to murder his son, or sacrifice his son. He thought he was supposed to, right? Abraham really thought that was the case. And yet, Abraham thought that God was going to resurrect him. That was the only way that he could reconcile these two parts of God. Fully loving, fully perfect, and someone who has put a bounty on all people for their behavior. There is a consequence and a debt that has to pay. We'll get back to that in a little while. And so the story of the Bible is it was created and perfectly, and then it fell, and if that's the end of the story, it's just bleak and hopeless and dark, which is what essentially a naturalist worldview and a humanistic worldview is offering us right now. Is it's just bleak and dark. It is what it is. It's just that it is, right? And so there's all this depression and hopelessness, and so that's the story really stinks, but that's not the story. The real part of the story actually happens right here in this beautiful moment between fall and the word that we would call it redemption. This literally means to buy back. So God says there's a bounty on our head, there's a price to be paid, and then someone's got to pay it. You know, throughout the scriptures where you see this happen between the fall and the redemption is there's some kind of sacrifice. Now, these are Band-Aid solutions for a temporal thing, not a permanent solution. Throughout the scriptures, there's this thing called a sacrifice where people would go, God, you are more valuable than our firstborn livestock. You're more valuable than all of our crops. You're more valuable than whatever these things are. So we're going to lay them before you as a payment for our disconnection. Really complicated. So they're trying to reconcile themselves to God. So there's this over and over again sacrifice. And typically what the sacrifice was some kind of innocent animal. So you see this all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve are naked. God says there's going to be punishment. There's going to be some hope, some redemption. Genesis 3:16. There's a proto-evangelium where God's going to says, but I'm going to save this. There's going to be a redeemer, and it's going to be my son, and through your offspring, Eve. And so we get this picture of that. But then immediately following that, what happens is God actually slaughters an innocent animal. I'd argue it's a lamb. You'll see why in a little while. And God literally slaughters an innocent animal, did nothing wrong, just happened to be walking through the garden. You know why he did it? To create clothing, literal clothing, to cover up Adam and Eve's private parts. They felt shame, they hid, and God says, this is not a permanent solution. But at least we can let you operate in this fallen world through this sacrifice. So blood is shed, and that's the first sacrifice and the first covering we see. So when God tells Abraham, you should offer a sacrifice, and it should be your firstborn, he's going, my firstborn hadn't done anything wrong, but innocence is what's slaughtered. So he literally goes up onto this mountainside to sacrifice his son. And as he's doing it, his son, Isaac, says, Dad, I see the wood, I see everything we need, but where is the lamb? Where's the sacrifice? Where's the innocent shed blood to say, God, we will say you're better than this, and we will acknowledge that with our fallenness there is this debt to be paid. And Abraham says, God will provide the lamb. And so, even to the moment where Abraham's about to sacrifice his son, there's this really neat moment where angel of the Lord comes and says, stop. Don't sacrifice him. You've acknowledged that God is greater than your greatest debt. You've acknowledged that God is greater than your greatest possession, your firstborn. And God says, in that moment, they kind of points Abraham and Isaac over into the brush, to the thicket, right? And the briars, and there's this ram, a lamb, who's caught up in it by its horns, really, really intricate, really neat. You'll see that through the rest of the scriptures today. And that means he's held in there, but his body is without blemish, perfect, spotless, and they make that sacrifice. And so you see this weird thing, and if you proof text any of this, you're going, okay, that God's weird. He likes to see bloodshed, and he has some infatuation with those woolly little animals, right? Like, so you got lambs, and you got blood, and so really complicated stuff. And it doesn't get any less complicated in this story. So there's a story. God redeems. The way by which he redeems is there's some kind of price to be paid. What God would tell you is he actually paid the price. In fact, the big idea today is God is always bending and shaping things, and he is always fighting for his children. Always. And he wants you to be his child. He's always fighting for his children, and he is offering full-on, family rights adoption in this moment. God is always fighting for us and always welcome us as his children. And so the picture of the gospel is God actually steps in and redeems us, but that's not the end of the story either, which is just so beautiful. God not only buys us back, offers us back, pays the bounty on our behalf, then he invites us back into what we would identify as purpose, right? That God didn't go, I'm not just going to save you. He's going, now that you get this, you now get to participate in what you originally created to do, which is to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. So he literally invites us into his story, which is very inefficient. There's a much better way to do this, and yet this is the way that God decides to do it. And we find ourselves in Exodus where there's a bunch of people who are created in God's image, and the Israelites, and they are enjoying God's favor for a couple hundred years, and all of a sudden they continue to choose their own plan over God's. They fall, and they find themselves enslaved to a horrific regime, the Egyptian army, right? So you got this whole story, and the interesting thing is, guys, you don't have to write this down. You're familiar with the story. It's every story you've ever known. Turn on the Hallmark Channel. This is all that plays there, right? Go to any superhero movie. That's it, right? Let's think about a romantic comedy. In the beginning, boy and girl meet. Oh, they love each other, right? Oh, no, there's some deep, dark secret. Tell them that you own Fox Books, Tom Hanks, right? Tell them that you're from Seattle, whatever it is, right? Whatever they're on, you got this secret, and you're yelling at the screen going, just confess it. But they never confess it, right? And then what happens? There's this huge breakup, and they go different ways, and there's just montages of them working and sad and sleepy and working out and sad and sleepy and never smiling, right? You got that. It's all broken. And then something happens here. Something strange happens where maybe it's repentance, maybe they confess sin, maybe someone else has to make a big sacrifice, maybe someone has to absorb the cost, but something happens, and the relationship gets redeemed, right? And then it's pretty. But that's never the end of the story. It always skips ahead a year or 2 years, at least 9 months usually. And there's a new scene, and there's usually a birthday party, right? And all the kids are playing. And the ones who are here now are here, and first comes love, then comes marriage, and now there's a little baby in a baby carriage, right? You know the story. You keep paying the price for the same thing. No, superhero movies, the exact same. Wow, there's a perfect metropolis. Oh no, an evil villain. We can't save ourselves. Maybe someone greater than us will save ourselves. Why hasn't he shown up yet? Because the Redeemer never shows up early, but he doesn't show up late. All of a sudden he swoops in. He saves the day. And now the city is restored, right? It's just the only story of all the stories, and so we see this with the Israelites. Things were good, then they get bad based on their own choices. And now they're in a spot where they find themselves completely enslaved. And they're going, God, will you save us? You've given us a promise. And there's this promise that God is saying, I will use you to restore. And this is what he tells Moses to tell them. This is in Exodus chapter 6. Here's what he says. I'm reading verses 6 through 8. Therefore, this is what God tells Moses to say to the Israelites. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. So I will free you from bondage and slavery. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will, see the word, redeem you. I will buy you back with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. So I'm going to redeem you back, and the way by which I'm going to do it is through my judgment, right? Through his justice. I will take you as my own people. I'll make you my child, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord, your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. So you'll know that you are freed. You'll know that you're redeemed. You're no longer enslaved, right? You'll know those things. Out from the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. Remember, I made this promise, Genesis chapter 11. I'm going to bless you so you can be a blessing. I'm going to make this promise that I will keep my word. Remember, I told my people I would restore the world. I told your forefathers, and now it's about to happen. I will give it to you as a possession. Why? Because I am the Lord. Right? He says, in his confidence and in his love, he's always fighting for his people. He's always fighting for his people, and so he's declaring that he's taken them to this place. Now, Exodus chapter 6 is a really beautiful verse. In fact, if you know any Jews that do like the Seder meal or the Passover meal, they actually quote this Exodus 6 they drink these 4 different glasses of wine to talk about God's deliverance and God's freedom and God's bringing himself to them and his redemption. And so just a beautiful part of it. And they go back as this as the verse where God declares these things. Now, we're about to pick up in Exodus chapter 12. And a lot happens in these these 6 chapters. Lots of horrific persecution, horrific stuff. And so I don't have time to cover it all, and it's pretty graphic, so I thought I'd show you with a cute little kids video that gives you the big picture, but definitely glosses over a lot of the real horrific pain in it. So here it is. Here's the whole story of the Passover in 3 minutes. Enjoy, and then we'll talk about it.
God's story, Passover. So part of God's story is about Passover, and it goes like this. It all started when the Israelites were stuck as slaves in Egypt. They were forced to work in fields and make bricks and mortar. Worse, the ruler of Egypt, Pharaoh, and the other people in charge didn't care if God's family was hot or tired or hungry or sad or hurt or just plain miserable. And they were. But even in the middle of all that, God's family grew. In fact, they got so big that Pharaoh was scared they might attack and overpower him. He made them work even harder to show them he was boss. Soon the Israelites were even more miserable. They begged God for help. Well, guess what? God saw what Pharaoh was doing to his family, and he didn't like it one bit. So he planned a rescue. He sent a man named Moses to lead God's family out of Egypt and into a brand new, beautiful home called the Promised Land. But when Moses told Pharaoh to let God's family leave, Pharaoh said no. Remember, Pharaoh thought he was the boss. The thing is, God is really in control, and even rulers of countries should obey him. So 9 different times, God sent plagues to show Pharaoh his power. The plagues were like punishments to Egypt for keeping God's family as slaves. After each one, Moses asked Pharaoh to let God's family go, but Pharaoh kept saying no. Then Moses told Pharaoh that God loves his family so much that he will rescue them no matter how many times Pharaoh refused to obey. So there would be one more plague, one that would wipe out the oldest son in every house in Egypt. But of course, God had a special plan for his family. He told them to take their best lamb or young goat, kill it, and paint the blood on the doorframe. Then they should eat the meat with bitter herbs and some flat bread made without yeast called unleavened bread, which is cheap and can be made quickly. In fact, God asked his family to eat the whole meal as if they were ready to run right out the door, with their shoes on and their walking sticks in hand. They obeyed. Good thing, too, because that very night the angel of death came. But just like God promised, he passed over the houses with blood on the door. Finally, Pharaoh realized God was in charge, and that God loved his family, and that Pharaoh couldn't stop God's rescue plan. He said God's family should get far away from Egypt. They left in a hurry. For hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after that, God's family celebrated the night God rescued them by eating unleavened bread, bitter herbs, and lamb. But that rescue was just a preview to the big rescue God had planned for the whole world. Remember, the ruler of this world, the devil, wants us to work for him and live bitter, sad lives, separated from God. And we all do wrong things sometimes and deserve to die as punishment. So God sent his very own son to earth. He lived the perfect life we should have lived and died the awful death we should have died. But 3 days after he died, Jesus came back to life. That means he got rid of death, and it can't separate us from God anymore. And you know what? Right before Jesus died, he celebrated Passover one last time, but without the lamb. See, Jesus showed us that he is our lamb. And just like the lambs died so that the sons could stay with their families, Jesus died so that we can be part of God's family. One day he'll recreate a perfect home for us, and it'll be even better than the Promised Land. And that's the story of Passover.
Isn't that a cute story? Yay, God kills a bunch of little kids so that Jews can get rescued and then go to heaven. No, I don't think it's funny. It is a little awkward, right? I mean, it's pretty rough. So we're looking at this great rescue plan, which is really easy if you're a Jew or a Christian to go, God is all for us. But there is a losing team, and the debt they paid was egregious, right? And we got to figure that out. So we're going to spend a few minutes trying to figure out, is God just in killing a bunch of kids and adults and livestock? I mean, is this a God we can worship? And if God is just, what is he up to in all this? And I think if you'll stay with me next 20 minutes, we'll work through all that, okay? But to make sure that I'm not making this stuff up, I'm going to read to you exactly how the story goes down, and then I'll offer some thoughts to the skeptic on this. And if you're skeptical, this is a really great time to be skeptical. Like, read through this and imagine this is the only scriptures you got in the whole world. Read through it as the skeptic. Go, God, this is pretty strange. So we're just going to read it, and then we're going to kind of come to some grips with what God could be up to. It's pretty neat if you stay with us. Here goes. Exodus, I'm going to start in verse 21, chapter 12, verse 21. Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, go at once and select animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. So God has just implemented these 9 plagues: blood, frogs, lice, flies, death of livestock, boils, hail, and that one's so bad that Pharaoh goes, okay, I'm sorry. But then he goes, psych, I'm not really sorry. And then he gets all these locusts and then darkness for a while. And then finally the 10th one is really going to get this guy's attention and go, you have all the power and you are oppressing my people whom I love. There is a bounty on your head. I am cashing in the debt, which by the way is the firstborn. They all belong to me. And so God is about to crush that, right? Crush them. Crush the whole thing. And so he tells Moses, and Moses is preparing these Israelites. So they're going to get this Passover lamb. The idea was they would take this perfect lamb that was without blemish, like Abraham and Isaac had, that lamb, like the covering for Adam and Eve in the garden. They would take this thing and they would slaughter it. They would show that the wages of sin literally is death. And you go, this is really strange. Can you really talk about death? Death looming for these Egyptians? Now, this is a little bit more heightened when you look at it this way, right? Okay, in this 12-hour period, God's going to wipe out a bunch of people, but the reality is, and you would agree with this, I think, death really is looming for everyone. Now, it might not be a 12-hour period, but we are very cognizant, we are very aware that death is out there, right? And death is the great equalizer. You can be rich, you can be poor, you can be healthy, you can be unhealthy. Death is the one thing that's kind of just out there looming in the distance. We don't know when it's coming. None of us want to receive it, right? So this isn't like this weird ethereal idea about death. I mean, we all experience this looming death. And I would argue the reason we shed tears over that is because deep down, we all know it wasn't supposed to be this way. There wasn't supposed to be death, and as a result of the brokenness of the world, there is this bounty. The firstborn, and then even a bounty for all of us. It says the wages, the cost of our sin, death. I don't know that I agree with that. Stay with me. But at least you now understand this is what God is telling us. He's saying there is a bounty on all of us. Firstborn, wages of sin is death. So we should prepare ourselves. And so God's going to say, hey, Moses, tell these people to offer this Passover lamb, this lamb, and slaughter it to innocents. Always happens. Shed blood always happens for the payment of whatever it is, and put it over your door frames and prepare. So this is what it says. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and on both sides of the door frame. Again, if you're pulling this out, you're going, this is a weird God. Like, this is strange. Like, feels like it's coming out of some Wiccan manual, right? Like, what in the world is going on in this? None of you, watch this, shall go out of the door of your house until morning. It's really, really important. God goes, okay, there's something else to happen. You're going to put the blood over the doorframe, and you're covered in that house. But here, be careful. Don't leave the house. Don't leave the house. You're going, what? God just did this. He just protected them. But they only really, like, the blood only covers, 800 square feet. Right, well, what's he saying here? God couldn't cover it all. And I think this is really, really important to understand. This was not the permanent solution for the Israelites' ailment. This was not a permanent solution. In fact, this is a very temporary visa. God is going, you're going to continue to get to live in this land, but this is a temporary visa. And right now, this shed blood, this sacrifice covers these 12 hours. Very temporary visa. This is a very temporary Band-Aid. Here's your 400 square feet you can stay in. Here's the 12 hours it covers. You should obey because God is calling in the bounty, right? This is horrific. But in this moment, and watch what it says next. Now, when the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on tops and sides of the door frame and will pass over that doorway. He will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. Yep, it's looming, but God is not going to allow it to loom over you because there is a temporary visa on you. There is a covering on you. And so they understood that in that moment. So watch what it says next. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. So hey, not only do it now, but I'm ordained that you remember this every single year. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you, there will be a day of restoration that I give you as he promised. Observe the ceremony. So hey, there'll be a day when I'm going to fulfill all this. And when you get there, you should start observing this ceremony, right? This ceremony. And when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? Then tell them, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our own homes when he struck down the Egyptians. So he's like, I'm going to give you some tradition. I'm going to give you a ceremony. I'm going to give you some liturgy. But every time you do it, You got to talk about why it matters to you. Not some root, memorization that you just spit out words, but you got to talk about what you're actually doing here, what you're actually celebrating here. One of the things we struggle with here is, like, for example, we're talking about the Last Supper today. A little bit. It'd be a really good time to have communion, but we do communion once a month here. And some of us said, hey, can we do it every week? Some of you come from, some Orthodox backgrounds or whatever, where you did it every week. And boy, I'd love for us to. But here's the dilemma. Even with baptisms, we want to make sure that when we take communion or we do baptisms, that we can actually explain to you what's going on. The last thing we want to do is give you some, cute little ritual that does nothing, instead of actually understanding what Jesus is doing with the communion or what Jesus has done in the baptism. And so we want to be really intentional every time we do it to talk about it. And fortunately, I already talked for a really long time. If we're doing communion every week, you guys would have to bring breakfast and lunch with you. And so, anyway, so here's the instructions. Here's what's going to happen. So be prepared to answer. Tell them it is the Passover, all those things. And in verse 28, the Israelites did what the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. So God basically says, there's a bounty. I'm cashing it in. You want coverage. I'm going to free you. But here's exactly what you should do. Pay careful attention. I am the God of the universe, and what I say goes. So here's what's happening here. And they all fell in line. Right? And then verse 29. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner, who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all livestock as well. You should feel the grief of this. These are real human beings, real kids, real adults, and this is real death. This isn't, oh, cute little story. No. On that night, some 3,500 years ago, there was deep horror, like none of us have ever experienced. And this last verse, man, Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was a loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. This is horrific, guys. Like, you've got to see the horror of this moment. This is real people in real life. And God literally wipes out the firstborn of this entire nation of people. There was not a house without someone dead. There was either a dead lamb or a dead kid. And you go, how do we worship this God? Right? That's a complicated thing. And hear me, there is nothing God is unwilling to do to rescue his kids. He is always fighting for us, and he will go to great lengths to redeem us, to buy us back, to take us out of slavery and into freedom. But in this moment, there is a losing team, and the horror they experience is beyond words. So, a couple things we got to wrestle through in this God. One, like, really? God, you killed a bunch of people? Like, is that okay for God to do? So we got to come up with whether or not we feel comfortable with what God did. Not that C.S. Lewis says that defending God is like a lamb defending a lion. Like, I don't feel this pressure to defend him, but let me offer some explanations I think would be helpful. Then after that, we got to go, okay, so once we get past the idea of a dead kid, or dead people, we got to figure out really if it's fair to be judged on morality. Like, who's God to define our morals? We live in a world of, post-modernity now, where none of us, we all live our own truth. Is that better? like, is there really an absolute true north we got to follow? So we got to figure out if morals really even matter in this, and how in the world could they come into play? And then I think the third one is, and I think a big one, if God is so loving, couldn't he just shine puppies and rainbows all over Egypt, and everybody just get happy, and no debt and no payment, and it just all worked out beautifully? Like, if God is loving, can't he just forgive all the debt? Does he really need to cash in the firstborn, right? So there's some things we got to figure out. And so let's start at the top. Okay, God kills a bunch of firstborns. That'd be an infant. That'd be a 35-year-old man, right? So you got a firstborn in the household and a son. You're losing grandsons and kids. It's horrific. Is that a loving God? Can God be loving and also push his judgment. I mean, this is the message that Abram had. God is telling me that I should give him my firstborn. He has every right. It all belongs to him. It's the most valuable possession I have, and God should be a greater valuable to me than my most valuable possession. I have sinned against God. I've turned my back on God. He has every right, since he's the creator of the universe, to create his own rules and call me to live by them and make me feel the consequences. I understand that, God. I can bring you Isaac, but how in the world can you be loving in this? Right? And in that moment, God says, I will provide a lamb. And you see that he provides a lamb. So what in the world could be happening here? A couple thoughts, okay? Some of these are trite, so stay with me. These aren't the good ones, but they have to be said. First, he's actually doing a lot less than the Egyptians were. Just firstborn, not all the boys, right? So what these Egyptian folks were doing was murdering all Israeli boys. So this isn't an eye for eye. It's a little bit less than an eye for an eye. Right? It's 2 eyes for 1 eye kind of thing. Not that that makes it right. Like I said, really, really try to answer. But what God is calling from them is less than the Pharaoh was already oppressing the other people with. So you got that thing. This is a reap what you sow, maybe, but I think it's even greater than that. So first, they're doing less than I would offer this. We think about, oh, poor innocent people. These Egyptians weren't innocent. They're watching people throw their living babies into the river, into the Nile River, watching them flail, and I don't know if critters get them. I don't know if water fills their lungs, but they are watching this. There is blood on their hands. Like, these are not innocent human beings, right? I mean, they like their power, they like their privilege, and they weren't getting in the way of any of that stuff. They weren't standing up for what's right. They're that kind of stuff. So these aren't innocent people, right? They literally are watching people suffer in pain and allowing it to happen. Right? So there's a bounty for that. But even that, again, trite. We're trying to deal with that loving God. And here's the other one I'd offer. So you got two different sides. You got a bunch of people like Pharaoh, like us, who say, God, we're not really interested in you. Want nothing to do with you. Eventually, they get their wish, right? But here's a couple I think might be a little bit more caring. What helps me reconcile this a little bit is the story of Noah and the flood. It's a horrific story. God literally drowns an entire generation, saves one family. There's a lot of babies in that one too. And you go, how in the world could God do that? The best thing I can offer, maybe this will be of some help to you in kind of reconciling it, is many of you are animal owners. You love your animals. You treat them like kids. You call yourself mama and daddy to them. It's weird to me, but that's okay if you do it. Come here to mama. Whatever it is. I like that you do that. I just can't do that. But you really love your pet. Some of you have dogs, cats, horses, whatever it is. And if you've had the animals for any period of time, one of them's gotten sick or gotten to the end of its age, and I've had this happen with one of our dogs, and it's just a misery, right? It's just a misery, or maybe it's snail biting kids or whatever it is, but you come to a place where there is no more good left for that animal. Like with a horse that breaks its leg, it's going to be in pain forever. So the most merciful and gracious and loving thing you could possibly do for that animal that you love in that moment is put it out of its misery. Right? I mean, I know people, I have good friends, who literally have taken a shotgun to their horse in deep love. Right? That's one of the most gruesome things you can imagine. But in deep love, they do it, right? So there is this idea that if there is no hope, no future, nothing good left to come, God in his gracious mercy could put people out of their misery. And I would offer, that's what I think the story of story of Noah is. This grieving God who in love removes them from any more pain or sorrow they create. You've got horrific Egyptians who were not innocent. And so in some ways could God, in all of his infinite wisdom, be removing them from all the misery they're going to live in the rest of their life. Maybe that's helpful. But the one I find most helpful, because again, these aren't innocent, but 3-year-olds are, right? Like a 2-year-old doesn't know these things. They're not shaped by their parents yet. And that infant that's wiped out, we got to reconcile that one. That was different than the non-innocent, that kind of stuff. And so the last thing I'd offer is this. There's really interesting passages in Psalm that King David later on, he has some kids, and one of the kids he loses in infancy, right? And he's in deep pain because why? This isn't the world that I thought this isn't how it's supposed to be. And David actually says something pretty neat to God in declaration that one day he'll be restored and reunited with that kiddo, right? Infancy. So this isn't a kid who can acknowledge that Jesus is Lord, can't confess his sins with his mouth, all those different things. And yet in this moment, David goes that boy's going to be with me. And then in Romans chapter 4, Paul actually refers to that and talks about it and firms it up. So both Old Testament and New Testament talk about this kid who is innocent beyond the capability of making his own decisions. And in both instances, it's firmed up that this kiddo will be with David in all eternity. So there's a real good hope here that God can not only be merciful in wiping people out of their misery, he might be really gracious in giving some of these kiddos the opportunity to bail out before judgment comes. Right? It doesn't fix all this. It's still really, really complicated, but it's more nuanced and it's more intricate than God just wipes out people. Right? Could all those people who God wiped out early on, either they weren't innocent and they were doing horrific things before, or they were so innocent that God goes, no, I'm just going to pluck you out of this and go and bring you on into eternity, bring you on into paradise. Perhaps that's the case. I find great comfort in knowing I'll feel really comfortable with however this played out when I get to heaven. I just don't have all the answers here. So that'd be the first one. That's what God could be doing with the killing piece. Here's the second one, though. It's really, God is grading them on morality. How do we know God's morality and how do we follow it? And should we really have to follow it? What's interesting is we would think those things, but if you do think those things, I challenge you to think a little bit more, because the reality is we love morality. We just don't like other people's. Right, here's what I'd offer. Okay. If you would just think about all the expectations you have put on other people, right? Like maybe for the next couple of days, next weeks, just start making a note of them. The times you expect someone to be on time when they're not. Say the things you want them to, not say the things you don't want them to. Wear the things you want them to, not wear the things you don't want them to. Go to the school you want them to. Whatever those things are. Like all the things, maybe just for your kids or your spouse. You don't have to look that far. Maybe a coworker, right? If you just list all the things that you would call them to and you would correct them on, okay? Then take that list and then just offer your own judgment of yourself. Okay, God, I judge people for not being on time. How many times this week was I late? Oh, okay, right? You see, we even start putting our own moral code of our expectations of others just over the top of ourselves. We can't even pass our own moral code, right? So there is no way we can do it. So we all have moral codes, and we can't even pass our own. And there's got to be some way by which we define and shape all this stuff for us. And so I just would offer, maybe it makes sense that there is a true north and a real moral code that we should follow. And if that's the case, and we judge other people based on their inability to follow our moral code, wouldn't it be fair for a God who created all things and wired all things to have his own moral code and then have an expectation that we follow it the same way you do of your kids? Right? And so, got some moral things. Okay, maybe it's worth considering. And then I think the big one is, okay, couldn't God just absolve the debt? Like, really? Do all people have to pay for it? Like, you say that there's this big bounty firstborn or innocent shed blood. Like, couldn't God just, like, snap his fingers and just not do that if he's all loving? And I would just argue, I don't think you really want that. One, because, cognitively, we know that every time there's been some kind of infraction between two people, someone always pays. There's never a time that someone doesn't pay. There's always a consequence to whatever it is. I tell you all the time, like, if you're to let me drive your car, hey, I'm going to go outside. Hey, can I drive your car down to Sunoco to get a Diet Mountain Dew so I can bring back a double gulp and everybody in church can judge me, right? Can I borrow your car and I take your car and I drive it down the road and I wreck it and I bring it back and it's all mangled. I'm like, oh, here's your keys, right? There's a couple options here. One, you got to deal with the awkwardness of going, hey, you're going to fix this, right? Right? So I got to pay for that damage I did. That makes sense. There's a consequence for the infraction, so I got to pay. Or you can feel so uncomfortable and you can do the right thing. And you can go, don't worry about it, Josh. I'll just cover it, right? So one of two things happens. Either I pay for the infraction or you pay for it, either by paying to get your car fixed or driving a mangled car and dealing with the judgment of that from here on forth, right? So regardless, there's always going to be a payment. Like when you and someone get in a fight, you can either forgive them and absorb that payment and sadness of the severance of the relationship, or you can cause them to feel the harm. How do you do that? You talk about them to other people, right? You bring as many people to your side of the argument as possible because there is injustice and there is always a payment. So there's never been in the history of the world a time when there has been an infraction and not someone pay. There's always a payment. So if that's always the case, you go, if there's an infraction between us and God, obviously there's got to be a payment. And so you can't just absolve that debt. In fact, with what's going on in our world, with these horrific mass murders and shootings, right? What would you think of the judge that goes, not that big of a deal. Go back at it, right? No, just walk out of jail. It's not a big deal. Here you go. Just go back in it, right? one, you wouldn't respect the judge because that's not just. And two, there's still a payment. Society will continue to pay for that person's behavior. Right? So there's always a payment. Either they pay for their transgressions or we pay for the transgressions, but there's never in the history of the world been an event where there is a disconnection or damage and someone not pay for it. So this idea that God would call in a bounty and require people to pay the debt they owe, people always pay the debt they owe. Either they do or someone else does. And so in this moment, God does what seems unthinkable, and he shows the real picture of the wages of people's sin and disconnection. And there's wailing. By the way, God actually refers to the hell and torment as a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, I would argue that that same Passover lamb that these Jewish folks put over their door frames was available to every single Egyptian as well. In fact, in 19, it says about the foreigner can follow these instructions. And later on, when they free the Red Sea, it actually tells us there's the Egyptians with them. So God, in his graciousness, was still making his atonement, his covering, his protection available to all people. And just the people who go, nope, not interested in you and God, they got their wish. They got nothing to do with God for the rest of their life and for all eternity. And so you see this horrific picture. So God says, here's what's going to happen. I want you to see the weight of it, and I'm going to free you from it, and here's how it's going to happen, and here's what I want you to do from here on out. Every single year, I want you to mark this moment of my redemption and bringing you out of slavery and bondage and into the promised land. Every single year, I want you to mark this moment with the Passover meal. Have a meal together, celebrate it, and you get to kind of use more of your experiences and more of your senses. And so for 1,300 years, from that point years later, 1,300 years, every year Jews would get together and have this meal. And there's a couple things that would happen. They would have these glasses of wine. There'd be 4 of them. And they would read that Exodus 6 that we talked about. In each glass of wine, they would acknowledge part of Jesus or God's redemptive plan through the Passover. God redeemed them. God saved them. God met them. God brought them out, all those things. Right? So they would do that. And then they would eat some bitter herbs to remind them of the pain and the suffering of what happened to the Egyptians to the Israelites under the Egyptian regime. And then they would break bread and they would acknowledge the affliction that their ancestors felt in wandering the wilderness. And then they would drink more wine after the meal and declare God's redemption. So every year people would get together. In fact, Jews to this day still do it. It's called a Passover, a Seder meal, and they would do this. Well, because Jesus was a Jew, we actually catch him 1,300 years after this moment of the Passover having this meal. So he has the same meal as a Jew with them, and it is transformative if you'll pay attention to it. And so in this moment, Jesus is actually about to have this meal. So he's going to have the wine, they're going to have it up, and I just want to set you up. This is what I would argue. We just read about the first Passover ever, and I would argue this is the last Passover ever, right? This is it. So we see 1,300 years, bookends of beginning and end of what the Passover is, and Jesus is about to have this meal, and I just want to read to you how it plays out. Luke 22, verse 7. Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Okay, so there's this Passover, and what they would do, they'd eat this lamb, and they would declare that innocent shed blood covered their redemption, right? That's what freedom. So they would eat, had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, those are 2 of his buddies, 2 disciples, saying, go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover. So Jesus is sending his folks to say, hey, we should do this. We should celebrate the Passover. We should celebrate God's redemption. But remember, this is a messy story for the Egyptians, right? So why in the world is Jesus participating in this? What is he saying? Is he not like Egyptians? Is he glad they died? All sorts of questions could come up. So Jesus sends them ahead. Verse 9, where do you want us to prepare for it? They asked. He replied, as you enter the city, this is so interesting, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters and say to the owner of the house, New England clam chowder. The teacher asked, that's not what he says. The teacher asked, where is the guest room? Where I might eat the Passover with my disciples. He will show you a large room upstairs, all furnished. Make preparations there. They left and found the things just as Jesus had told them, so they prepared the Passover. Really interesting that Jesus is like, let me tell you how this is going to work. So this is helping them gain some confidence. This is God bending and shaping all things for our good and his glory. So he's showing off his ability to do these things, give Peter and John some confidence. They're going to need it later, so they go and it plays out just that way. Verse 14, it says this. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. So this is indicating that this is a long meal. Tabling in the New Testament meant like hours of time. There wasn't lots of different things to do for entertainment, so food was where it's at. And so they would progress over a meal long. There'd be about 10 to 20 people at a Passover meal, but that's about all that could eat a lamb, and you had to eat every bit of it. So these guys were all there, the disciples and Jesus, and they're reclining at the table. And he said to them, so interesting, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. So he's going, I'm going to suffer. They don't know what's going on yet. And he says something, he says, I have eagerly desired. Now, our English doesn't do a good job there because the Greek actually would be translated something like that. Like, I desired to desire that I've desired. Like, so in the Greek, to really add emphasis, they would double up a word, like glory to glory, grace to grace. So this is a desire of desire. So he's like, I've desired too much. I desired the desire that I had for this meal. So he's saying, there is nothing on my calendar that has been more important to me than this. I mean, that's the kind of emphasis it is. Now remember, he's about to die on a cross. And he is saying in this moment, this is what I've been looking forward to. This is it. This is it. And he's literally saying, hey guys, this table has been set. And they're like, yeah, we know. And he's like, no, it's really been set. So he is highlighting and emphasizing that this is a moment that transforms every moment before, every moment after. So he is calling their attention. So they're like, yeah, it's just Passover. We've done it all of our life, right? And so Jesus is like, I have really looked forward to this. I'm about to suffer, but this is the moment. This is it, guys, right? So they're probably a little interested. He's just watched their feet. This is all sorts of confusing. And so he says these things. So I imagine their interest is piqued a little bit. And then it says this. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. So he's going, hey, look, I've looked forward to this because this moment's about to bring the redemption of my people. Now, this isn't restoration yet. There'll be a day when all of it's perfected, and we will have this meal again together. But that day's not to come. What we're doing right now is I'm about to flick that domino, and it's about to set in motions of dominoes all over the place, and there'll be a day where it will arrive at its final destination, and then we'll eat again, but this isn't that day. And he says, after taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, take this and divide it among you, for I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. So this is interesting. You're familiar with communion probably in the Lord's Supper, and you've always thought about wine and bread. So you eat the bread, drink the wine. Jesus actually has them in this moment drink the wine twice. So this is the first time he says it. And so in a Passover meal, this would have been kind of the start of the Passover. So Jesus goes, let's get started. And they would have drank it, and they would have made some quotes about Exodus chapter 6 about God being their deliverer or bringing the one who meets them. And so they would have that, and then they would start the meal. So Jesus kind of commences as the head of it. So he's the one they know he's the one leading Passover. And he's saying, here's the story. Let's get started. Drink your wine, and let's get to the food. So after taking cup, so he gave thanks, and take this and divide among you. And he says this, for I tell you, I will not drink again for the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. So this is redemption, not restoration. It'll be better, but pay attention. Start watching the dominoes fall, right? Verse 19, and he said this, and he took bread. They would have known this year after year. And he took bread, gave thanks, and he broke it. So they're familiar with this. And what would happen in the Jewish Seder or the Passover, they would break it, and they say, this represents the body of our Egyptian ancestors' affliction. So this is a reminder of what they went through and all their pain. And so they're saying there's lots of pain in this world as a result of the fall. There's lots of pain. But Jesus, that's not interesting. He gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body given for you. This has been brand new words. They would have never heard these words before. They would have all thought about it. They would have thanked their ancestors for fighting through that. And Jesus going, no. There's a different type of affliction. And they got them a promised land. And then there was a different promised land. So they're going, whoa, what Jesus are you talking about? And so they would start paying attention. This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. 1,300 years, different saying, and all of a sudden, this weird saying about the bread would have showed up. He's going, this is the day I wanted to. Look at this. My body broken for you. I'm the afflicted one now. I'm going to pay the pain. Not the Egyptians, not the Israelites. I'm going to absorb the debt, right? In the same way, see this, after the supper, so they would have drank the wine. Jesus would have passed out some bread, and all the gospel accounts catch this, and they just talk about the bread. And the next thing we know, they're finishing up a meal. By the way, I'd argue that's not a very good meal, just bread, right? In the same way, after supper, he took the cup. After the supper, he took the cup, saying, this is the cup. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. So this would have been time they would take kind of like the dessert wine, and he would have held it up and said, this is for redemption. They would have known that as the redemptive cup, and he's going, I am redeeming you. This is for redemption. This is the cup. And he says something, new covenant. They're going, whoa, there's been a covenant before. God promised that he would get his people out of slavery and into the promised land. God told Abraham he'd be a blessing to all people. Wait, that was the covenant. But that was for a temporary visa. Wait. Is there a new visa? Is he talking about something else? He's adding a new covenant. So we know God always does what he says he's going to do. So Jesus, what are you talking about? There's a new covenant. Where's it coming from? And he says, in my blood, which is poured out for you. So he goes, here's a new covenant. You are welcome here. And the way by which that happens is there is pain and suffering, and innocence does have to be shed, just like with Genesis, with Adam and Eve, and just like with Abraham and Isaac, and just like the Passover. But the difference is I'm now the blood that's going to be shed. And so they had been paying real attention to this. They had gone, okay. He's talking weird about the bread. That's one of the ingredients. That's weird. Okay, he says that he's that. And now he's talking about the wine, and he's calling himself the blood. That's one of the ingredients. Hey, is Jesus crazy? Because he's saying some weird stuff, and he forgot our entree. Right? Aren't we? Is this over? Aren't we supposed to be eating some? Aren't we supposed to be eating some lamb right now? Hey, where's the lamb? Right? Like all of a sudden, they would have been peak interest going, what in the world's going on here? Jesus is now saying he's paying the price, but his body's going to be afflicted. He's saying he's going to cover us with the blood like the lamb, but there is no lamb. Where's the lamb? And what Tim Keller says, so interesting, he says, the reason there was no lamb on the table is because the lamb was at the table. He's saying, you don't need the lamb anymore. The lamb, temporary visa. And in that moment, I imagine they would have started connecting all these dots, and they would have remembered this guy, and they would remember John the Baptist in John chapter 1, Jesus' cousin. He shows up and he says this. He says, behold, the Lamb of God. And they'd be like, why is he calling him the Lamb of God? That doesn't even make sense. Who takes away what? The sins of the world. So in this moment, Jesus is going, look, yeah, there's been affliction, there's been pain, and it's wreaked havoc on the whole world, but I'm resolving it. And the way I'm resolving being both loving and just is I'm going to handle both sides of it. In fact, Paul wants us to get this so much. In Romans chapter 3, after telling us we're all broken, all fallen short, we are not good, he tells us what Jesus does for us. And the band's going to come up as I wrap this up, and it says this. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement. That means substitute. God's blood actually is covering us. The same way the lamb's skin covered Adam and Eve. The same way the lamb's blood covered the Egyptians. God is nailed a covering through Christ as a sacrifice of atonement. Through what? The shedding of his blood to be received by how? Faith, this confidence in who God is. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness. He needed us to understand he was perfect, and there is a penalty for sin. There's a penalty for going, God, we like our plan better than yours. That's where death looms, right? He did this to demonstrate his righteousness because in his forbearance, that means his long patience. He was patient to sinners. He is patient to people who stuck their middle finger up at him. He is patient to those who turned their back on him, right? In his forbearance, he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. There was a lot more than what just the Egyptians did. And God, in his graciousness, left those sins unpunished. Why? He did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so as to be just. Oh, he's a perfect God, and there is a penalty for sin. Just and the one who justifies. So in this weird, nuanced, intrinsic thing, Jesus shows up and goes, I am requiring a penalty and I'm calling it in. You know what it is? Firstborn. Calling the firstborn in. You know what Jesus is called in the scriptures? The firstborn of all creation. The God of the universe called in the debt. And guess what he had to do? He had to give up his own son. You see, this is a much bigger picture than Jesus loves us asking him into his heart. He has been writing his story since the beginning of time, and on every page, he's leaking in some foreshadowing where it all kind of comes to a head, and he goes, I am both just and justifier. This is like the M. Night Shyamalan. I see dead people, right? This is world-changing. This is revolutionary. Jesus goes, here's how I resolve it. I pay the price, and I call the price in. So my dad said there's got to be a penalty, and Jesus goes, okay, I'll take it. That's why he says whoever confesses their sin, God is faithful. He's going to do it, and just, to forgive us from all unrighteousness. Jesus is literally going, you've got to stop beating yourself up because I was the lamb and I was already slain for this. You've got to accept it and allow it within faith to allow it to cover you. Now I'm just offer if this is for the skeptic. This is hard for you to get, I get it. But I would say seek through every worldview. We all know there's a creation. We all know we got here somehow. We all know the world should be different than it is. And there is no worldview that shows this just God who also is the justifier, who's the suffering Savior, who literally bears the price for all of our sin. And so here's what I want you to understand. There is nothing God will hold back from his children, including his own son. He is fighting for us. And he's inviting you in faith to go, yep, Jesus, I want you to cover me as well. So would you consider being adopted into this family that God covers with his own blood? And we're going to sing a song to kind of firm up that understanding of who God is, and then we'll be dismissed. Would you stand with me as we sing?
You are not flesh and bone. You are not weak or slow. You're everything brave and bold, and you're fighting for us. You are not distant or cold. Your heart's not angry or closed. And even in ways we don't know, you're fighting for us. You won't hold back when it comes to your children. You fiercely defend us till we stand delivered. You're fighting for us. Always fighting for us. You never close your eyes. You've never been surprised. Whatever war may arise, you're fighting for us. You move with holy grace in all your miraculous ways. We simply stand here amazed, 'cause you're fighting for us, fighting for us. You won't hold back when it comes to your children. You fiercely defend us till we stand delivered. You're fighting for us, always fighting for us. You don't back down, facing armies of thousands. You speak one word and they scatter around us. You're fighting for us, always fighting for us. How great the love, the furious love of the one true Father. How great the love, the conquering love of the one true God. You won't hold back when it comes to your children. You fiercely defend us till we stand delivered. You're fighting for us, always fighting for us. You don't back down, facing armies of thousands. You speak one word and they scatter around us. You're fighting for us, always fighting for us. Who is fighting for us? Always fighting for us. Who is fighting for us?
Oh man, I want that confidence for us. I want us to walk and believe that that's the God of the universe who intrinsically and so nuanced put this whole world together and was bending and shaping it all to bring us to a place where we could surrender to him and trust him and then be in community with him and with other people. And I would invite you into that. And so if you're new here, been around here for a while, this week starts back Cal Connect on Wednesday. Please, please, please do what you can to get here at 5:30 for a meal. And if you can't make it for that, 6:15, we start lots of classes. You can join me learning about prayer. Should be lots of fun. That's it. You guys have a fabulous week. We'll see you Wednesday and hopefully Friday night for the movie.